Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this D-Zone Fireside Chat, Increasing Dev Performance, KPIs, AI, and Bottlenecks, sponsored by Pieces.app. Everything we do today relies on software, from running our cars to running our businesses and even our homes. It's no surprise then that developer productivity is on the minds of every executive, manager, and every developer. With increasing demands on teams, we're experiencing both individual and team productivity bottlenecks, difficulty building suitable KPIs to track the right things, and adapting to the rapidly evolving role of AI in development workflows. We all know the consequences of not staying ahead of this: slip project timelines, poor quality, shortcuts, higher stress, burnout, and stagnated innovation. If you're an executive or manager trying to get the most out of your teams, or a team member, a developer looking for ways to improve your productivity, this discussion's just for you. We'll leave you with actionable strategies designed to elevate both your teams and your own individual performance. We'll even be answering questions in real time, so make sure that you take a moment if you want to ask a question and write it in the chat. Before we get started, I want to introduce everyone on the call. I'm Jesse, Chief Technologist at D-Zone, and I'm thrilled to be hosting some powerhouses in the industry with us today. Savo Knott, CEO and technical co-founder at Pieces.app. Brian Powell, CTO at CenterGrid, also a serial entrepreneur and a startup advisor and mentor. And Brian Lambert, founding machine learning engineer at Pieces.app. If you find today's discussion valuable and want to explore more exciting events just like this one, head on over to dzone.com/events, where you can access all of our on-demand content. Now, as we get started, guys, I saw recent studies are showing that 20% of developers' time can be lost due to inefficient workflows, bottlenecks, and everyone listening is going to want to know how they can do better at this. So with that, I want to understand, what is the weakest link effect and how can it hurt team performance?
Yeah, I can go ahead and jump in there. Thank you everyone who's listening in, and both Brian from Pieces and Brian Powell for joining us, and Jesse for the great kickoff. But you know, when I think about the weakest link effect, I think that it's really just like an information silo somewhere, right? It's someone who is not verbose in their documentation. They're not capturing that work in progress journey. They're not really kind of like going through the nitty gritty of how they got to an end result. So what happens in that kind of absence of information is you might have a project handoff, or you might be onboarding someone to a team. And that weakest link effect is really someone didn't necessarily capture like that end result of code. They might be a great developer, but the weakest link is how you got there. And that's kind of my interpretation. So, you know, capturing like the key components of the journey as opposed to the final result. I think GitHub's great at giving you the final result, but how you got there, for us, I think that's the weakest link effect in action right there. There's a lot of ways to look at that. I'm sure Brian, Powell has his own definition, and I'm sure Brian from Pieces does as well. But my 2 cents is a gap in information when it comes to handoff and onboarding. Yeah.
All right, Brian Powell, what do you think?
Yeah, Savo, I agree with you. I think most of the issue that we see with the weakest link effect has to do with, at the end of the day, we pay software engineers to make decisions, and how they got to those decisions is very important for understanding the entire process. So could be a gap in how the decision was made. It could be a gap in the input into that decision that was made. And so the weakest link is caused by multiple sort of effects, right? It can be sort of a not understanding the task that's being done. It could be, you know, in the moment of making the decision, you made the wrong decision because you're making it in a silo, or it could be even a post effect of the decision was made and not communicating to others. That creates a weakest link, like passing that weakest link effect on. So being able to identify that and come up with tools that help with sort of that knowledge transfer and helping with those decisions, it's definitely like a top of mind piece, because that can create bottlenecks and create all the different issues that we do see around code, and sort of the effects of it coming through.
And how do you identify these productivity bottlenecks? Like we just talked about them a little bit, right? How do we identify those? And then we got to come up with strategies on how to fix them, right? Mm-hmm. So Brian Lambert, what do you think?
Internally, where we see this the most, I think you could, if you wanted to quantify how often we bottleneck, I would look at how many times in our work group chat someone says, "Hey, how did you do this?" or "Has anyone seen this error before?"
Okay.
And how much easier would that be if all of this was documented in a workflow, and you just queried some internal software development piece like we're building at pieces that could give you the answer without taking time away from someone else's day.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I would say, the quantification of it is really difficult, but I think from like an abstract perspective, you can kind of feel the lack of velocity, especially early on in a project, or you can certainly feel it when you're bringing someone new into a project, right? And it's like, what are the reasons it takes so long to onboard an engineer to a team, be it any size of project? Obviously, as the size of the project goes up, it's like harder and harder, especially if it's like, an engineer that's like, all like connecting the dots, right? Cross-functional full stack engineer. They have to understand a lot of that kind of work in progress journey and how a lot of these sub decisions got made to kind of culminate to the final project architecture. But you can feel it. It's kind of like unknown. And at the management level, you're like, hey, why is this project taking longer? And it's also like, this is one of the basis for Brooks Law, right? Adding more people to a project that's late will only make it later, because it's like, they're already moving fast. They're cutting corners wherever they can. They're certainly not documenting, right? And it's just like, okay, you add another person to that. Well, that's the weakest link effect, at scale, snowballing. So I don't know if there's a way to quantify it, but the feeling culminates to frustration at every level. Frustration for the person onboarding, frustration for the managers, frustration for even the end users when a product release gets delayed or has bugs or is just not stable or not high quality. So, the feeling for me is the indicator, to be honest.
Okay. And it's a good point. I mean, what you mentioned with all the pressure of doing build day after day, making sure I release, it's not fun. It kind of kills culture. So team dynamics has to play into this too, right? If we're going to be increasing productivity, it can't just be a management or executive, thumb turning screws and forcing things out the door, right? So is there ways that we can increase collective performance, nurture individual growth, and not sacrifice team dynamics? That's the question.
Well, I mean, I think just jump in here. I think, there's elements of a lot of people like to think of the process that they're running, whether it's Scrum or Lean or, extreme programming. They like to just like select one aspect of it and just drive with it. The idea that, that Scrum is a process. It's like Scrum's an actual approach, right? It's not the process. It's, so many people are like, oh, we're running Scrum. It's like, you don't actually run Scrum. Like you run a version of it. But there are things that you can do. A lot of the things like inside of extreme programming where there is more time taken for pair programming and sharing of knowledge and taking, senior developers and pairing them with juniors so that you can bring the juniors and track them up faster. Tools like, like we're seeing that are coming out like pieces where, they're crawling through code and reducing the rework, right, that's being done. I can't tell you how many times you'll go through a code base and especially with in JavaScript, oh my god, the Lodash and underscore and all of the like little helper apps. It's like how many people like love to use a like filter a function that is the same like across different ones, but you'll end up with all of them pulled into the same project, right? And then there's nothing to sort of dedupe that, or even functions that are very specific. You'll have a developer that it was done over on let's call it the right hand side of the code base, and on the left hand side of the code base you need the exact same function, and they'll reprogram the exact same thing. You know what I'm saying? And because they want their version of it, right? And so reducing just providing more visibility and reducing things and, having tools that are constantly sort of looking over the code base and finding, optimizations and things like that, they can go a long way. But, there's also that element of, your senior engineers, that process of reviewing code as it's coming in, and being mindful, not of just their area, but of the whole project. When you get into those, the larger projects that have a bunch of different developers, the adding more developers doesn't speed up anything. It just produces more code, and more code is not necessarily the result that you're looking for. less code that does exactly what it's supposed to do is really the end result of what you're looking for there. So,
yeah. And Brian, I would just add to that. You just made a great point. When I talk about how AI is introducing even more chaos to the developers, it's like every developer out there now is enabled to almost like you can trip into blindly writing a ton of code with these co-pilots, right? And then the volume is just going way up. And if you don't have that like connectivity between who to talk to about this, what documentations to look at, basically when someone else on your team was doing the exact same thing and just short circuit, go, figure out, hey, is there anything I can reuse or create a module for and pull it in like that? Like, it's going up very fast with the introduction of these co-pilots, and now that is compounding. And also, oh, by the way, developers are hearing from their managers that you should move faster because this AI tool just sold me on this 10, 20, 30% efficiency thing. Yep. And I'm going to be upset if you're not moving faster, right? So it's this weird kind of paradigm, paradox that's occurring right in front of us.
And one of the things I want to get to, I do want to talk, we're going to get to AI in a second, but you hit on something there, Sava, that I don't want to miss. We have the ability to structure how we want things to play out through KPIs, right? So I want to take a second, right as we're getting into the AI conversation, I think we all agree KPIs are important, right? But we have to track the right things, getting to the point you were just making. So how do we factor that in a world of AI? Like you just said, you don't want code to explode and all that. How does KPIs play into this intermix between what we're trying to do and that AI thing that keeps slapping us in the face?
Yeah, I think that every kind of organization has their own like set of KPIs, but a couple of them, are maybe like deployment frequency or, maybe like, the average time it takes for a team to recover from like a failed config or like a failed server deployment. The other one is code churn, which is basically, the amount of code that's getting folded over or refactored, right? And if you kind of get into that process of like an infinite loop, infinite refactoring, like that can be really, brutal. There are a lot of tools to track these at large out there, and the tools kind of scale in proportion to the organization size. But for us, I think, Brian kind of hit on anecdotally there is, that there's a large duplication effect going on, and there's a lack of standardization simply because these folks, they come in and they don't know who to talk to, right? They don't know where someone else left off. They don't know how that person even got there and what internal docs they looked at or what previous examples they built on. So, I think like for us, the end goal is, reducing those cycle times. You want to see a reduction in code refactors, and you want to see an increase in kind of, time to incidents repair, because, hey, we can go find something very quickly, or we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can reuse something that's already working on a deployment config or on a scalability config or on a security config, right? Stuff like that. So it's hard to pin down one exact thing, but I think that at large, these are some of the things that we're trying to, reduce, right?
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Is making sure that, if I'm hearing you right, the KPIs remain relevant and they're adapting to the nature of the development work that we find ourselves in today.
That's right. I think it's always going to be the same. Less is better, right? Less is more, just like what Brian was saying. And I think like you're going, every time you kind of go from more to less, what's actually going on there is a standardization, right? And if you want scalability, you have to reduce exceptions, because every time you introduce an exception to a code base, a config, whatever it might be, you add a log function to your inevitable scalability, right? And I think like that scalability is directly tied to these KPIs, right? They want to see you continue to move faster and faster, regardless of the team size, the code base size, whatever else. And it's almost impractical, right? Because managers and others want exponential, right? But like the nature of all of this is logarithmic. So there's that strange singularity point that we're just trying to, move further and further out, if you will.
Yeah. And I love the idea that we're trying to make sure all this stuff fits in. I do want to say we're about halfway there. So for those of you out there, remember, you can drive questions that we'll be answering in the chat. So take a minute, write a question as we're in the midst of our discussions. We'll make sure we keep an eye on that. And then as we're switching over to AI, Brian Lambert, want to get over here to one of our machine learning and AI guys. When we're talking here about how we set up KPIs right for productivity, Savo said expectations are changing with management. Brian Powell was telling us how impactful it is to be using the tools in the first place, but only if we use them well and we're not copying stuff everywhere, right? What are some of the most significant challenges that developers are seeing right now with integrating AI into their workflows?
Sure. So I think right off the bat is that there's an assumption that these large models like ChatGPT are always correct. That is, we need to put a big red flag there, because not only it compounds the effect, because not only do we have more code, we have potentially more bad code, because you can write code that you kind of don't really know a lot about. Like, for example, earlier this week, I needed to write something about multi-threading in C++. I've never done that before. But now it passes all our unit tests and it works great. And it will probably go into the app for review. But like, there's all sorts of this happening every single day where people are writing very complex code that they really don't know much about. And so that's my biggest red flag there is AI is great, but at its current state, the best of our models that we have publicly available, the code they likely spit out is at the quality of a junior engineer. We need to remember that. It can do a lot of menial tasks. It can really speed up our workflow, but don't think this is like a senior engineer quality that doesn't need review. That would be my biggest piece to say there.
All right, Brian Powell, you look like you wanted to say something, man. Get in there.
Yeah, I mean, as the chat GPT conversation, continues to evolve of, it writing and assisting with code. A great point was made is that, it basically is the level of a junior developer, right? But it's funny because, before that it was Stack Overflow, and you just go to Stack Overflow and you copy a bunch of code. It was like crowdsourced, like now it's like, oh, I can go find the answer myself, but it's not going to be completely right. And like, the learning curve of, the chat GPT piece of it is, it's giving you something that probably is going to work and get you to where it needs to be. Mm-hmm. Stack Overflow, you at least had to understand, the background and how people were writing it and do the research. And so, I don't know. And you know what, not to jump back to go to the KPIs, but like to touch on it real quick, KPIs are driven by OKRs, which is organizational key requirements, right? And so like KPIs need to be, they don't need to be so granular that, that they are like, they're impossible to measure against the organizational like requirements, right? The organizational requirements drive the KPIs in such a way that they just provide you some measure of you're moving in the right direction at a speed, not necessarily like, we broke the build this many times, or like, whatever, like if you have KPIs that are written at the level that if you break the, like your organizational key requirements affect how many times you break, your build and your code, like you need to rethink your OKR, your entire KPI OKR strategy. So with that, we'll go back to the AI conversation. I'm sorry. I was just trying not to lose it on
listen
that.
Up.
Yeah.
Doing it right. Got it. Yeah. Good stuff. And as we go through this, Brian Lambert, near and dear to your heart, and Savo, both of y'all, give us an example. Like, so ChatGPT though isn't all bad, right? If you look at the numbers, people are migrating away from Stack Overflow and using ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot, right? We mentioned that one earlier. So it can't all be bad, right? So is AI in this ChatGPT or other AIs, are they boosting developer productivity? And then how do we balance the productivity gains with the creativity, right? Of the individual creativity with what is, I mean, we're developers here, we'll say it. Development is part art, right? It's a creative act. So I'm interested in both of those things.
I think that, off the top of the mind for me, if you will, the developer's job has always been to half remember something and look up the rest, right? And it's pretty funny, because that statement is often followed by "don't reinvent the wheel," right? And I think like that's why we have open source packages. That's why we have Stack Overflow. That's why we have dev channels in our company to connect you with the people, the resources, the documentation that you need to avoid reinventing the wheel. With generative AI, though, effectively you're kind of reinventing the wheel every time, right? Every time you prompt it, you're going to get kind of this like self-enclosed, self-encapsulated result. Of course, GitHub Copilot is a lot more atomic because it's like line by line, function by function, but there's really no middle ground, right? At that point in time. And, Brian, to your point around Stack Overflow, right? The great thing about Stack Overflow was it was stack ranked. So the good stuff bubbled up and the bad stuff bubbled down. And I think like, we also don't really have that with the generative AI stuff yet, right? So it's like the same stuff, getting, just churned out over and over and over. And it really comes down to how good you can ask it or prompt it to give you what you want back, right? And that's a skill that's also, trying to get developed very quick. Like as developers, the 10x ones are great Googlers. I think the 10x ones of the futures are going to be great prompters, right? Knowing how to work this thing to get what you want out. And so for us, though, the focus is not on like, having AI write all the code for you or things like that. I think the focus as a developer will be connect the dots, right? Get out of the nitty gritty kind of mundane stuff, let that become automated, but now, apply more creativity, connect dots, like become more cross-functional, more full stack. And as Brian said earlier from our team, he was saying, I just jumped into a problem on multi-threading C++. The next day I might be in a Python code base doing, some data cleaning. And the next day I might be doing ML ops and GitHub Actions, right? And so you're like, okay, now I'm solving more variation in these problem types and moving faster. So, the role of the developers starting to become more full stack at a higher velocity and a different variance between those problem types. So that means that they're visiting more docs, right? If you think about that, he's on Python docs, on GitHub Action docs, and on C++ docs, all within a week, right? So how do you capture those docs, make sure that they're there when you have to circle back to the problem? Then how do you also overlap that with others on the team that have been doing the same exact thing, right? And if this is Brian, I can tell you everyone on the team is going to be having the same scenario. And then they get into the code base and they actually execute on code. How do you connect all three of those workflow pillars that are moving faster than ever? I think that's the challenge that we want to solve with AI, as we also kind of create these new innovations to let AI increase the volume of everything and the speed of everything. So that's my high level kind of just like, it's good and it's bad. It's a double-edged sword.
It is, but it's also a good segue. And Brian Lambert, maybe you can start off with this one. It's also a good segue in how it's changing developer workflow. Right. So as you were just, mentioning that we have typical phases in a developer's workflow, and AI is influencing and altering these phases. And Brian, can you tell us a little bit from your perspective about those phases and how they're changing and evolving today?
Sure. Yeah. And I think Sava really going to hit the nail on the head with this one. I think they're really two in one problem. So the developer's role is changing, and like what it means to be productive as a developer, or how you become productive as a developer is completely changing. And ties into your previous point. It's the creativity of the developer is no longer it'll shift farther away from developing very custom algorithms and difficult programmatic things, and more like, how do I write the best prompt I possibly can? Because most of the code will likely come from an AI model. And so everyone will need to augment their workflow to stay up to pace. If you're a developer and you want to stay completely siloed and offline, you don't want to interact with this incredible tool, you're going to get left in the dust. But it will change. The models will continue to get better and write better code, but the developer will never be replaced, because we have to remember that these models don't just generate things on their own. The developers have to prompt them. The ideas come from us for a bit, maybe 100 years down the road, you never know. We'll have an AI Brian and Savo in here writing pieces of code. But for now, the ideas need to come from us, and the debugging needs to come from us. We need to critically think about the outputs that these models are giving us. And there are no models that are going to exist for a long time that are going to outsmart us from that creativity standpoint.
Yep. And specifically on the workflows, like I mean, you're talking about the front end, the coding, but it goes through every piece of what a developer does day by day, right?
And Brian Powell, I'd love to hear, what's your advice for, execs like yourself at, 1,000-person orgs, and also, all the way down to startups that are trying to figure out how to make, these tools improve their burn, right? So, hey, can you do more with less cash? And obviously that's important at the, the enterprise level as well. But what's your take on some of these things? What are you seeing?
No, it's an interesting question. A lot of the shift that I'm seeing is to sort of layers and layers of abstraction, right? Where, these no code tools that are coming in that are starting to, allow you to create, websites and, like backends and, everything just based on, putting in a model and, somehow it, pumps into, the experience that, that you're looking at. The main issue that I'm seeing with the tools that are sort of the no code, quick, is that they're great at producing sort of the minimal viable product, nothing that's actually hardened and ready to go. Like I like to say, use in anger, as much as possible. So it's great for prototyping to put out a proof of concept. The idea of taking a no code solution to like full scale production is going to be so expensive. It's going to be 10x more costly than writing something custom yourself to support in the long haul, right? Not, if you build something custom, you are probably going to lay out more at the first piece of it. But everything needs to be, and I'm, going to throw it over to Salvo and Brian here. Like, how many times has pieces been rewritten or like, re-envisioned every time, right? Because, you started down the path and you need to make a correction, and so much time will be spent in sort of that zigzag of getting to the end product with no code, where you'll just put in another thing, and all of a sudden you've cobbled together 20 to 30 things that are all looking at, doing that one particular task, and it just becomes unmanageable because you've got the effect of, oh, I'm going to change this thing over here. Well, now I've got to change these other 5 things over here, and it's just it's constant, sort of down the road. So, from a large enterprise standpoint, I understand the solutions that need to get out to the market quickly and they need to be tested, right? You can use sort of a no code, solution there. But as soon as it goes past an MVP and it's going to go to actual production, it's time to engage the heavy hitters. And Salvo, I think it was you or somebody who said that software developers are artists, right? And it's about the toolkit that they build up. And the only difference between a junior developer and a senior developer is the size of that toolkit. How much code have you interacted with? How many decisions have you been forced to make? Right. And can you and are you making the right decisions, and have you been on that curve long enough of growing your skills and finding, is it front end, is it back end, is it full stack, is it DevOps? All of that is really important. But AI is definitely something that can help you with that, but you need to not just take it blindly as what you're doing, but take it in the context of everything that you're learning in the code that you're producing and allow it to help from that perspective.
Yeah. And we've moved from the workflow discussion, and we kind of got into the last topic we want to touch on here for a couple of minutes in our last time together. But it's really, how do you, as a developer or as a manager at a company, whether a big one or a small one, prepare your developers for the future? We've talked about how AI is a disruptive technology, but it can also be destructive, right? In terms of how many jobs are going to be gained. I mean, if you're a mid-level marketing communication specialist, your job is in danger. Listen, you're in danger, and it's happening everywhere. So as we move our discussion towards preparing developers, I like, Brian, where you were going with that. You've got to be good at understanding that AI is not your final product, right? I love that you said it's the beginning, it's the proof of concept. But what are other ways, opportunities and challenges and some real hard advice. Sabo and Brian, will throw it back over to you for developers to take away from our conversation to ensure that they maintain this creativity while still harnessing the benefits of AI.
I would say that, the main thing for me is like, can you make a larger organization feel smaller with AI, right? And even like some of the stuff they're trying to do to make AI, have higher fidelity outputs and stuff like that is still like, you hear this concept, retrieval augmented generation. It's so funny because a developer, like I said earlier, their job is to half remember something and look up the rest. Same with AI, that same architecture is like, go retrieve, augment, ground the model, and then generate, right? And so, at the end of the day, it is having the relevant information, the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why, like within a first or second degree, access availability of what that developer is doing right there. So if you're working with a co-pilot and you had law of diminishing returns, who do you talk to, right? Who on your team is that senior engineer with that toolbox, that's a little bit larger, that you can say, all right, this co-pilot didn't get me where I needed to be. I now need to reach out to someone, right? Even figuring that out in a large org is a big challenge. Or like, hey, I'm on the left side of the code base and I'm on the right side, like what Brian said. How much of the left side of the code base might be documented that you just have no idea, because it's a million lines of code and you're just not over on that side of the code base. Like, how can we leverage AI to surface the right things, the right people, the right like workflow overlap to you at the right time? I think that's the challenge that we're trying to solve here, because there are going to be a whole lot more dots as things, move faster and faster. And a developer's job now is to connect those dots, not get stuck in the nitty gritty. And I think what Brian, was talking about with the larger toolbox is, you have these tools, but these tools are also kind of like the dots you connected along the way, where you're like, hey, that's maybe not the best way to do this. I can automate this process here. Boom, new tool in the toolbox, because you made the connection between two inefficient items to standardize it and make it an efficient process. So that's my general approach to how things might evolve. Yeah.
Awesome. I love that part. Balancing human intuition with AI's capabilities, key to future development success from what I'm hearing. Well, Savo, Brian Lambert, and Brian Powell, thank you so much. What a great conversation we had today. We're out of time, but I really enjoyed taking what we know in today's environment and giving some practical advice for people, for all of you out there, trying to increase your team's productivity through the use of overcoming bottlenecks, integrating AI into our workflows, and then celebrating our success through KPIs. We covered a lot of ground in a very short time. Feels like it took 5 minutes. But for everyone out there tuning in, the message is clear. Maintain a proactive stance on culture, right? Making sure that we're still doing all the human things while focusing on productivity, evolving workflows. That's what's going to unlock your team's full potential. Sincere thank you and appreciation going out to Pieces for sponsoring this event, and to our wonderful audience. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you were inspired, helped, or really want to share today's discussion, head on over to dzone.com/events for more content. If you would also spare just a moment to fill out a quick survey post-chat. We're always looking to improve. And thanks again for spending time with us today. Stay productive out there. Bye.